13:07 in Paris, 12:07 here in London. A gunman who killed a police officer and seriously wounded one of his colleagues was shot dead in the heart of Paris last night. The attack came just days before France begins the process of electing a new president. Security forces, including the country's elite military units, were already fully mobilised ahead of Sunday's vote. France remains in a state of emergency, as it has done since coordinated attacks in the capital in November 2015. I'm joined on the line from Paris by the French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani and by Shashank Joshi, a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Nabila and Shashank, welcome to you both. Nabila Ramdani, if I can begin with you in Paris. What sort of mood is there in the city this morning? Because as we're saying, this is certainly not the first terrorist attack within the past 18 months, but coming so shortly before Sunday's vote. How is it likely to affect things?
Well, the shooting is absolutely horrific, and it is the last thing that Paris needed. The last thing that Paris needed is another barbarous act of terrorism, frankly. And this is clearly aimed at disrupting a democratic election. But of course, it's horrific at any time. And the first thing to say, really, is that the far-right candidates, and by which I mean both Marine Le Pen of the National Front and the increasingly hard-right François Fillon of the Republican Party, are trying to turn this barbaric act into the biggest event of the campaign. Both cancelled their routine electioneering this morning and held press conferences solely devoted to security. And they clearly believe that this election could be fought on the ongoing terrorist threat, particularly from so-called Islamic State. Other candidates, I have to say, are more inclined to see security as one of a number of very serious problems that France is facing, and by no means the only one.
Well, it's striking, Nabila, as you say, that both Monsieur Fillon and Ms. Le Pen had said before, well, look, we are going to cancel our events tomorrow. We're postponing any campaigning, suspending any campaigning. And yet they've then given press conferences talking about this attack. So they're, in a sense, they're campaigning by in another name, aren't they?
Yes, indeed. And Marine Le Pen, as I said, held a press conference this morning in which she has tried to capitalize on the horror, just as she always does. And she started ranting about the need to expel foreigners and indeed to stop all immigrants, whether legal or not, coming into France. And so this is, it's another platform for her to put out her fiercely anti-immigration stance. But this is despite the fact that the overwhelming evidence points to a born and bred Frenchman, and indeed a career criminal, who is well known to the French authorities, being responsible for this terrible act of terror.
Okay, let me just bring in Shashank Joshi now here, because Shashank, as we were saying, Paris and France has been has had a state of emergency for 18 months now, since November 2015. How unprecedented is this?
Well, I think sheer length is unprecedented. During the 1960s, we did see domestic political instability, and you had a state of emergency, I think, from April to September 1961, when there was a putsch. And, of course, during troubles in Algeria in the 1950s, there was a state of emergency as well. And that was, I think, in two different occasions, 1955 and 1958. And then again, you've had it in the 1980s on a small French possession in the Pacific Ocean. And probably most recently, some of you may remember, of course, the unrest in 2005, the civil unrest in France. That wasn't, of course, terrorist-related, but there was also an extended state of emergency at that time. Of course, this is different insofar as it's extremely prolonged. There's no obvious end in sight. There's no moment at which you could say the terrorist threat has suddenly been lifted. And, of course, it spans such a politically sensitive period.
And Shashank, talk us through what a state of emergency, certainly in this case in France, actually means in terms of, how does it affect people's day-to-day lives?
Well, I mean, in some reasonably substantial ways. It gives a lot more power to the security services and the police. They can conduct house searches at any time without judicial oversight that would normally be necessary. They can enforce house arrests in a way that would otherwise not be legal. They can confiscate certain types of weapons, even if you hold them legally. And they can even do things, quite basic suspension of basic civil rights, such as setting curfews, forbidding mass gatherings, setting up secure zones where people can be monitored in much more intrusive ways. And I think, in a way, one of the most substantive aspects for Europe is, of course, border controls. The Schengen Agreement, which governs free movement and no border controls between a set of European countries, that's not really operating at this point. The French have far more substantial border controls than they normally would for lorries and trucks and trains and so on and so forth crossing their border. Of course, that wasn't enough to prevent this suspect from coming in from Belgium, it seems.
And Shashank, just finally, as you say, this is, terrorism is something that, as Emmanuel Macron, one of the candidates last night said, is something that France is going to have to deal with for years to come. The state of emergency was supposed to be lifted, in fact, just a day or so after the Nice attack, and now it's been extended. And has it become something that actually the French president, whoever he or she may be after May, will have some difficulty lifting if that terrorist threat is still as high as it has been over the past 18 months?
Undoubtedly. Whoever takes office is going to be told by the security services that the risk remains high. There are thousands of suspects. They can't all be tracked. And he or she, and of course we hope it's a he in this particular case, will bear an enormous political risk should they lift the state of emergency and should something occur on their watch in the earliest days of their administration. It could really torpedo their entire government. I think the solution isn't necessarily to eliminate all these controls and checks. It's to realize this is a long-lasting threat, that although we shouldn't legislate in a panic or in a fear, it's better to have carefully thought-out laws debated by your legislature, which then take the place of short-term emergency laws, rather than relying on this sort of really emergency sort of provisions that are so far-reaching. And I think basically long-lasting laws would be a more reasonable solution to this.
Shashank Joshi, thank you very much. I just want to return to Nabila Ramdani in Paris. Nabila, obviously the vote on Sunday for the first round is not just about security and issues of immigration and integration, as Marine Le Pen may well be hoping for. But do you think that is going to be more at the forefront of voters' minds now than it perhaps would have been?
Yes, absolutely, and not least of all because politicians such as Marine Le Pen and François Fillon want to present, these these attacks as an existential threat, not only to France but to Western civilizations. And this is what they will be trying to do this weekend in order to try to win more votes from another terrorist incident. And it could certainly lead to a spike in vote with people who are prepared to accept this narrative. Other candidates are more circumspect, and they are suggesting that efficient policing is the key to solving these problems and not an ideological war. Remember that early last week, two prospective killers who had threatened with murder a presidential candidate were arrested in Marseille. So there's every indication that intelligence and intelligence policing can actually work. The trouble with the Le Pen and Fillon approach is that it usually involves demonizing millions of perfectly law-abiding Muslims and other ethnic minorities and portraying them as the enemy within.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Nabila Ramdani in Paris, thank you very much